What happens when an empath says no for the first time? Jung predicted it, Huberman proved it. There's a moment in every empath's life, a moment that changes absolutely everything. It's not when you first realize you feel too deeply. It's not when you notice you absorb other people's emotions like a sponge. It's not even when you finally understand why parties drain you or why you need so much alone time to recharge. The moment that transforms an empath forever is much simpler and infinitely more powerful. It's the first time you say no and really mean it. Carl Jung predicted this moment over a century ago. He wrote that the assimilation of the shadow gives a person body and substance, that without integrating what we reject in ourselves, we remain ghosts, floating through the lives of others. Now, the Huberman Lab is confirming with neuroscience exactly what happens in the brain when an empath finally sets boundaries. And what they've discovered explains why this simple act of saying no triggers such an intense neurological storm. Today, you'll understand the science behind the most important transformation an empath can experience. Chapter 1. The Empath's Invisible Prison. To understand what happens when an empath says no for the first time, we first need to understand the prison they live in. Imagine waking up every day in a body that functions as an antenna for the emotions of everyone around you. You walk into a room and you immediately know who's sad, who's anxious, who's hiding anger behind a fake smile. You didn't choose to have this ability. It simply exists, and the price of this extraordinary sensitivity is living in a constant state of overload that most people will never understand. Empaths aren't simply sensitive people. Research from the Huberman Lab on the nervous system reveals that highly empathetic people possess significantly greater activity in their mirror neurons. These neurons make you literally feel what others feel. But there's something even deeper happening in the empath's brain. The insular cortex, the region responsible for interoceptive awareness, is also more active in empaths. This means they not only perceive the emotions of others, but they feel them physically in their own bodies. When someone close to an empath is in pain, the empath might feel a tightness in their chest. When someone is anxious, the empath might feel their stomach clench. The empath's body responds to other people's emotions as if they were their own. When someone close to you is sad, your mirror neurons activate the same brain regions as if you were sad. When someone is anxious, your body produces cortisol, as if the threat were yours. One fascinating study discovered that 26% of people show a physiological cortisol response merely by observing others in stressful situations. But in empaths, this number is drastically higher. This means that empaths live in a constant state of emotional overload. They carry not only their own emotions, but the emotions of everyone around them. And here's the central problem. To survive this overload, empaths develop a defense mechanism that becomes their greatest prison. They learn to say yes to everything. Why does saying yes protect the empath? Because when you say yes, you avoid the other person's discomfort. When you say yes, you don't have to feel the disappointment or anger that your no would cause. When you say yes, you maintain external peace, even if it destroys your internal peace. Jung called this inflation of the persona. The persona is the mask we wear for the world. In empaths, this mask becomes so thick that they forget who they really are underneath it. The empath's persona is always agreeable, always available, always ready to help, always saying yes. And every yes that isn't true feeds the shadow. Jung described the persona as a necessary mask for social life. We all need a persona to function in society. The problem arises when the mask fuses with the face. When you forget that there's someone beneath it, For the empath, this fusion happens gradually over years. Each time they say yes when they want to say no, the persona gets a little thicker. Each time they ignore their own needs to attend to those of others, the mask becomes a little more rigid, until one day, the empath looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize the person they see. They've become a function of pleasing others instead of a complete person. This is the most dangerous moment in an empath's life, because it's in this moment that the shadow begins to scream. Chapter 2. The shadow of yes. Jung taught that everything we reject in ourselves goes into the shadow, and the shadow doesn't disappear, it grows. For the empath who always says yes, the shadow contains something very specific. It contains all the unexpressed anger, all the accumulated resentment, all the frustration of years saying yes when they wanted to say no. But the shadow also contains something precious. It contains the power to say no. It contains the ability to set boundaries. It contains the strength that the empath so desperately needs, but so greatly fears. Jung wrote that confronting the shadow is like finding gold amidst the garbage. The no that the empath so fears is exactly the gold they need to reclaim. The Huberman Lab explains why saying no is so terrifying for empaths. The amygdala is the region of the brain responsible for detecting threats. In highly empathetic people, the amygdala is hypersensitive. It interprets the slightest possibility of conflict as real danger. When an empath considers saying no, the amygdala fires as if a predator were attacking. The heart races, the hands sweat, the stomach clenches, the whole body screams danger. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational thought, tries to calm the situation. It knows that saying no isn't really dangerous. But the connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex in empaths often favors the amygdala. This means that fear wins over reason, and the empath says yes. Once again, each time this happens, the pattern strengthens. The neural circuits that connect saying no to danger become more robust, and the shadow gets heavier. There's another important neurological phenomenon happening here. The Huberman Lab has documented how avoiding feared situations strengthens fear over time. Each time the empath avoids saying no, they reward the brain for being afraid. The amygdala registers that the fear was correct. After all, you avoided the dangerous situation and nothing bad happened. That must mean the situation really was dangerous. This is a vicious cycle that self-perpetuates. The more the empath avoids saying no, the more terrifying saying no becomes. The more an empath says yes out of fear, the more resentment accumulates within their shadow. And the more resentment that builds in the shadow, the more violently it will eventually explode. Carl Jung warned that a repressed shadow becomes increasingly primitive and powerful. It doesn't just disappear because it's ignored. It only waits for the opportune moment to emerge. And when it does, it often does so in destructive ways. The empath who never says no often explodes one day. Years of pent-up resentment erupt all at once, frequently directed at the wrong person, at the wrong time, and then the empath feels guilty about the outburst and promises never to let it happen again. So, they go back to saying yes to everything, and the cycle repeats. This cycle can only be broken in one way, by consciously saying no. Before the shadow forces an unconscious no. Chapter 3. The breaking point. But then, something happens. One day, the shadow becomes too heavy to bear. One day, the empath's body simply can't take it anymore. One day, the pain of saying yes outweighs the fear of saying no. And on that day, the empath says no, for the very first time. Jung described this moment as the beginning of individuation. It's the moment when a person starts to become who they really are, instead of who others want them to be. But what actually happens in the brain at this moment? The Huberman Lab has documented the neurological changes that occur when someone finally sets a boundary after years of people-pleasing. First, there's a massive spike in cortisol. The body interprets the no as a life-or-death situation. All the programming from years screams that you're in danger. Second, the amygdala becomes hyperactive. It frantically searches for signs that its prediction of disaster was correct. It looks for anger on the other person's face. It looks for rejection. It looks for the end of the relationship. Third, and here's the crucial part, the prefrontal cortex starts to work in a new way. It observes the situation and frequently discovers something surprising. The world didn't end. The person who received the no may have been uncomfortable, may have been surprised, might even have been irritated, but the relationship didn't end. You weren't abandoned. The disaster that the amygdala predicted didn't happen, and this discovery changes everything. Jung called this moment confronting reality. The entire structure of fear that the empath built over years was based on a fantasy. The fantasy that saying no would lead to total rejection and abandonment. When the empath finally says no and realizes that this fantasy doesn't correspond to reality, something breaks within them, something that needed to be broken. The illusion shatters, and with it goes a piece of the prison. Chapter 4. The neuroplasticity of no. The human brain is plastic. That means it can change and reorganize based on experience. When an empath says no for the first time and survives, something extraordinary happens in their brain. The Huberman Lab explains that every time the amygdala predicts disaster, and the disaster doesn't happen, the neural circuits reconfigure. The connection between saying no and danger begins to weaken. But here's what makes the first no so powerful. The first no creates a new memory, a memory that it's possible to say no and survive. This memory becomes the seed of a new way of existing in the world. Jung called this death of the ego. It's not that the ego literally dies, it's that the empath's old identity, the one that always says yes, begins to dissolve, to make way for a more complete identity. This new identity includes the ability to say no. It includes the permission to have their own needs. It includes the right to exist without constantly taking care of others. And each subsequent no strengthens this new identity. Research shows that setting boundaries activates the brain's reward system. Dopamine is released. The brain registers that saying no when necessary is a good thing. Over time, the empath develops what neuroscientists call response flexibility. Instead of automatically saying yes, the brain now has the option to evaluate each situation and choose the appropriate response. This is the freedom that Jung promised when he spoke about shadow integration. But neuroplasticity requires repetition. A single no isn't enough to completely reconfigure the brain. The first no opens the door. The subsequent no's keep it open. The Huberman Lab has found that it takes approximately 66 days of consistent practice for a new behavior to become automatic. This means that the empath, who wants to truly transform their relationship with boundaries, needs to practice saying no regularly for at least 2 months. They don't need to be big or dramatic no's, small. Everyday no's are sufficient. I won't do overtime today. I can't help with that right now. I'm not available at the moment. Each small no is a brick in the construction of a new cerebral architecture, an architecture that includes the option to refuse without panicking. Chapter 5. The guilt that comes after. But it would be dishonest to talk about the first no without talking about the guilt. Every empath who says no for the first time experiences a wave of guilt that can be overwhelming. It's important to understand why this happens and what to do about it. The empath's guilt comes from several sources. First, there's the childhood programming. Many empaths learned early on that their value comes from taking care of others. Saying no contradicts this fundamental programming. Second, there's the hyperactivity of mirror neurons. The empath literally feels the discomfort that their no caused in the other person and mistakes this discomfort as evidence that they did something wrong. Third, there's the still unintegrated shadow. The part of the empath that was trained to please screams that they've made a terrible mistake. Jung taught that guilt can be a valuable guide or a cruel prison. The difference lies in how you process it. Healthy guilt says, I did something that contradicts my genuine values. Neurotic guilt says, I did something that contradicts the expectations of others about me. The guilt that the empath feels after saying no is almost always neurotic guilt. It's not based on having done something genuinely wrong. It's based on having contradicted the programming to please. The Huberman Lab suggests a powerful practice for processing this guilt. When the guilt arises, pause and ask yourself, did I really do something wrong, or did I simply do something that displeased someone? Displeasing someone isn't the same as doing something wrong. Healthy people displease other people all the time, simply by having their own needs. This distinction is fundamental for shadow integration. There's a Jungian practice called active dialogue that can be very helpful here. When guilt arises, you can actually talk to it, as if it's a separate part of you. Ask guilt where it's coming from. Ask it what it's trying to protect. Often, guilt is an older part of you that still believes your worth depends on pleasing others. It needs to be heard and gently updated with new information. You could say to guilt something like, I understand you're trying to protect me. You learned that saying no was dangerous, but I'm an adult now, and I can take care of myself. Saying no doesn't make me a bad person. It makes me a whole person. This kind of internal dialogue might seem strange at first, but Carl Jung demonstrated repeatedly that talking to these internal parts is one of the most powerful forms of psychological integration. Chapter 6. The transformation of relationships. When an empath starts saying no, their relationships inevitably change. And here's a truth that can be difficult to hear. Some relationships simply won't survive the empath's no. Carl Jung was very clear about this. He taught that relationships based on persona don't survive individuation. If someone only loves you for the mask you wear, that love isn't really for you. When the empath starts saying no, they discover which relationships were based on who they really are and which were based on their utility. People who benefited from the constant yes often react badly when the no appears. They might accuse the empath of having changed, of having become selfish, of not being the person they knew anymore. And in a sense, they are right. The empath has changed. They're becoming more themselves and less of what others want them to be. But here's the good news. The relationships that do survive the empath's no become infinitely more profound and authentic. When you can say no, your yes suddenly has real value. When people know you establish boundaries, they trust you more. Paradoxically, Saying no leads to more genuine connections. The Huberman Lab confirms this in research on relationships. People who establish clear boundaries have more satisfying and long-lasting relationships than people who say yes to everything. The neurological reason is interesting. When someone always says yes, the other person's brain learns to devalue that yes. It becomes expected, predictable, without any real meaning. But when someone sometimes says no, their yes becomes an event. The other person's brain registers it as significant. Dopamine is released. The yes of someone who knows how to say no is much more valuable than the automatic yes of someone who never refuses. Carl Jung observed this in his studies on relationships. He noted that excessively agreeable people were often less respected than people who established clear boundaries. Total availability, paradoxically, diminishes the perceived value of the person. This doesn't mean that the empath should become unavailable or hostile. It means that the ability to choose when to be available makes their availability more meaningful. Chapter 7. The first no protocol. Based on everything Carl Jung taught and what modern neuroscience confirms, here's a protocol for empaths who are preparing to say no for the first time. Step 1. Choose something small. Your first no doesn't need to be a huge confrontation. It could be refusing a social invitation when you're tired. It could be not answering a phone call when you need some time alone. It can be any low-risk situation where you'd normally say yes. The reason for starting small is neurological. You're creating new brain circuits. Small circuits are easier to build, and they become the foundation for larger circuits. Step 2. Prepare your nervous system. Before saying no, practice diaphragmatic breathing. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. Exhale for 6 seconds. This activates the parasympathetic nervous system and reduces the reactivity of the amygdala. The Huberman Lab has demonstrated that this technique can reduce the stress response by up to 40%. Step 3. Say no without excessive justifications. Empaths tend to over-explain. They feel they need to have a perfectly valid reason for saying no, but excessive explanations often weaken the boundary. A simple no, thank you, or that won't work for me is sufficient. You owe no one explanations about your needs. Step 4. Endure the discomfort. After saying no, you're going to feel discomfort, guilt, anxiety, fear. These feelings are normal. They're the shadow protesting against the change. Don't try to make the discomfort go away. Observe it, breathe through it. Remember that feelings are not facts. The discomfort will pass. Step 5. Celebrate survival. After the discomfort subsides, consciously recognize that you survived. The world didn't end. You said no, and you're still here. This conscious celebration is important because it helps the brain register the experience as positive. It strengthens the new neural circuits that you're building. Step 6. Repeat with increasing frequency. After your first successful no, find another opportunity within a few days. Don't let too much time pass between practices, or the brain will revert to the old patterns. The goal is to create a new normal, where saying no is simply an available option, not something dramatic or scary, just one possible response, among others. Over time, you'll realize that saying no becomes increasingly easier. The neurological storm subsides, the guilt becomes briefer, the freedom becomes more present. Chapter 8. Continuous integration. Saying no for the first time isn't the end of the journey. It's the beginning. Carl Jung taught that individuation is a process that lasts a lifetime. Each time you integrate a part of the shadow, other parts reveal themselves. The work is never complete, but it gets easier over time. For the empath who started to say no, the next step is to continue practicing. Each no you say strengthens your ability to say no in the future. The neural circuits become more robust. The amygdala becomes less reactive. The prefrontal cortex gains more control. Over time, saying no ceases to be a battle and simply becomes an available option. The Huberman Lab calls this mature self-regulation. It's the ability to choose your responses instead of reacting automatically. Empaths with mature self-regulation still feel intensely. They still have highly active mirror neurons. They still absorb emotions from others. The difference is that they now have the ability to process those emotions without losing themselves in them. They can feel the sadness of another without becoming sad themselves. They can perceive the needs of others without automatically trying to satisfy them. This is the true freedom of the empath. There's a Jungian concept called the self that is relevant here. The self is the totality of the psyche. It includes both the conscious ego and all the unconscious contents, including the shadow. The empath who never says no is identified with only one part of themselves: the agreeable part, the part that cares for others, the part that says yes. They've rejected the part that can say no, and that part has gone into the shadow. Shadow integration is the process of reclaiming that rejected part, of realizing that you can be both the person who helps and the person who sets boundaries. Both the person who says yes and the person who says no. This totality is what Carl Jung called individuation, and the empath who integrates their no becomes more whole than they were before. They still feel intensely, still perceive the emotions of others, still have the gift of empathy, but now they also have the ability to protect themselves, to care for themselves, to exist as a complete person, and not just as a function of caring for others. Chapter 9. The Ultimate Paradox. Carl Jung often spoke in paradoxes, and there's a fundamental paradox at the heart of this transformation. When the empath learns to say no, they become capable of loving more deeply. This seems contradictory. How can establishing boundaries lead to more love? The answer lies in the difference between genuine sacrifice and compulsive sacrifice. The empath who always says yes isn't really sacrificing for others. They're sacrificing out of fear of saying no. Their yes doesn't come from love, it comes from terror. When the empath can say no, their yes becomes a real choice, and real choices made freely are the foundation of genuine love. Carl Jung wrote that you can't give what you don't possess. The empath who never says no doesn't possess themselves. Therefore, they can't genuinely give themselves to anyone. But the empath who has integrated their shadow and reclaimed the power to say no now possesses themselves and can choose when and how to give of themselves. This is the gift that the first no offers. It's not the gift of closing yourself off from the world. It's the gift of finally being able to open up for real. The Huberman Lab confirms this paradox in studies on altruism. People who practice self-care and establish clear boundaries actually help others more in the long run than people who constantly sacrifice themselves. According to Andrew Huberman's research, the reason is simple. The empath who never says no eventually burns out. They go into burnout. They resent the people they help. Their body gets sick. Their mind becomes exhausted, and they end up being unable to help anyone. But the empath who knows how to say no preserves their energy. They can continue helping for much longer. They help with quality instead of quantity, and their help comes from a place of genuine choice, not from fear or obligation. Paradoxically, the empath who says no ends up saying more meaningful yeses throughout their life. Conclusion, the invitation. If you're an empath who never says no, I want to extend an invitation to you. Find a small situation this week where you would normally say yes, but would like to say no. It doesn't need to be anything dramatic. It doesn't need to be a huge confrontation. It could be something as simple as refusing an extra task at work or not responding to a text message immediately. And then say no. Feel the discomfort that comes afterwards. Observe the guilt, perceive the fear, and then observe how the world doesn't end. This small act may seem insignificant, but it contains the potential to completely transform your life. Carl Jung predicted this. Andrew Huberman's research proved it, and now you can experience it. Your first no awaits you, and behind it is the person you really are. The person who's been hidden in the shadow all this time. The person who's finally ready to come out. One last reflection. There's a huge difference between being a good person and being a person who's afraid of seeming bad. The empath who always says yes often isn't truly kind. They're terrified of the possibility of being seen as selfish. Their kindness is actually fear in disguise, but the empath who can say no and chooses to say yes, that is a genuinely kind person, because their kindness is a choice, not a compulsion. Carl Jung wrote that the truly good person is the one who knows their own darkness, who has integrated their shadow, who can be cruel, but chooses to be gentle, who can say no, but frequently says yes. This is the integrated empath, and this empath begins to exist the moment you say your first true no. That moment is within your reach, now, today, at this exact instant. As you finish hearing these words, your first no awaits you. All you need to do is say it.